Well, good morning, everybody. Has it been a good morning? Yes, it has. Well, let's have a word of prayer, and I want to welcome you to our 9 o'clock presentation, and it's been a tremendous blessing. Let's have a word of prayer as we get started. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for your many blessings. We thank you for life. We thank you for health. Lord, we thank you for the promise of your soon return. May we be ready in every way, Lord, as we prepare for that glorious morning. I just pray in a very special way that you will continue to be with Dr. Deal and that you will continue to bless each presentation that he shares with us here. May we be encouraged and challenged and comforted moving forward to practice your health principles. In Jesus' precious and holy name we pray. Amen.
Good morning. How many of you have been enjoying Dr. Hans Deal this week? Amen. Yes. So I was very privileged to have a class with Dr. Hans Deal about 25 years ago, and he came to the college where I was attending and did a one-week intensive, a little more intense than you all have here, but as a college student, it was a huge blessing for me because I had grown up with health principles all my life, and I was at a place where, I needed to make decisions if this was going to be my lifestyle or not. And Dr. Deal presented such a solid foundation for me of how these principles are not only in the Bible and the spirit of prophecy, and also have been proved with scientific research, that it just laid a foundation for me that has followed for the rest of my life. So anyway, I hope that you will join me in welcoming Dr. Hans Deal this morning. Thank you.
Slide number 1. Good morning, everybody. Are you excited being alive and being well and getting better? You're in the right place. This morning, I want to talk to you about the rich background, the rich heritage that we as an Adventist denomination share in terms of holistic health concepts. So I'm delighted to be with you this morning again. I feel privileged to address you this morning to talk about our health message. My guiding text. Hello? So this morning, our message is entitled, Our Health Message, A Sacred Trust. And we're talking about new frontiers in health outreach, and we're talking about the right arm of the gospel in action. Are you ready for this? Let's take a look. Next one, please. Our guiding text this morning is found in 2 Chronicles 20, verse 20. Listen to me, O people of Judah and Jerusalem. Believe in the Lord your God, and you will succeed. Believe and remain steadfast to his prophets, and you shall prosper. Well, Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, is badly shaken. I mean, he has only a motley ragtag army, nothing to brag about, and he's facing a vast multinational army that is moving towards Jerusalem. And the king knows he's in bad shape. The king knows he is in trouble. And then the king prays a heart-rending prayer. And the Lord answers through one of the priests. Don't be afraid. Don't be paralyzed by this mighty army, for the battle is not yours, but God's. Tomorrow, take your places, stand quietly, and see the incredible rescue operation God will perform for you. Don't be discouraged or afraid. The Lord is with you. And the next morning, as his motley ragtag army, nothing to brag about, moves into position, the king steps forward and calls them to attention. And he says again, listen to me, O people of Judah and Jerusalem. Believe in the Lord your God, and you will succeed. Believe and remain steadfast to his prophets, and you shall prosper. My, oh my, at the end of the day, the mighty multinational army is totally wiped out, is totally destroyed. Not a single soldier of the enemy escapes without any losses to the king's ragtag motley army. God is in charge. Now, today we find a new awakening in our society towards intelligent self-care for the chronic diseases as they're now going global. They started in America, and as American culture, as American lifestyle, as American diet spread globally, these diseases went global as well. Well, let me tell you, one of the leaders of this new movement towards intelligent self-care is on the screen here. This is Pastor Rick Warren. He is a well-known pastor. His church has some 30,000 members, and he was the pastor that offered the dedicatory prayer when President Obama was inaugurated. He has written many, many books. He has written the purpose-driven books, Purpose-Driven Church, the Purpose-Driven People, and he is one of America's most powerful religious leaders that is trying to reach the world. Well, what is very special about Rick Warren is that he would often baptize 5, 10, 15 people at a time by immersion. And he noticed that when he came to the end of the group that he was baptizing, that his arm was getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And he became very worried that one of these days I may not be able to get him out of the watery grave, and they stay there. And he said, I need to do something about this. Then he began to search through the Holy Scriptures. Is there something that I can learn of how to strengthen my arms? And then he began to realize that he noticed that the people that he was baptizing were all very heavy people. And he began to realize, maybe it's not my weakening arm, maybe it's the enlarging weight of the people I'm baptizing. And he said, I need to help these people to lose weight. And he looked at himself in the mirror and he said, oh my goodness, I'm overweight myself. And so he began to look through the Bible. Is there any guidance that we could find of how to manage our weight more properly? And he came to the first chapter of the book of Daniel. And he read the story, and he saw that Daniel was talking about a very, very simple diet of foods as grown. And he said, I'm going to try this. And so he began to think of developing the Daniel plan for his congregation. 30,000 people. He told the people, we are getting too large. We have no more space in our church because we take up all the space with these large, wide bodies. We need to slim down and make more room for more seats so they can bring people into the church. And he said, how many people want to join me in the Daniel plan? And 14,000 of 30,000 people said, we will. At the end of the one-year experiment of using the Daniel plan, the people had lost 250,000 pounds. And he said, now, praise the Lord, we have much more space in our church. Now we can bring more people in through evangelism. And he began to talk about the idea that we need to glorify God with our bodies. And here you see the results. 250,000 pounds shed in that one church. An incredible story, isn't it? Well, what's really interesting to me is that Pastor Warren made a powerful prediction, a commitment. He said, this is what the world needs. The globe is becoming overweight, period. We need to reach the people. And he said, I want to reach 8 billion people in the world with the Daniel plan. That's everybody. And I thought to myself, Pastor Warren, you're really a Johnny-come-lately, because the Adventist people have known this since 1863. But what have we done with it? Here's a pastor that discovers Daniel 1, and he says, I want to take this message to the world. How about us? Have we lost the vision? Have we lost the energy? Have we become so secularized by the American culture that we have slipped into the American way of life without even realizing it? Now, you see, today, one of the most popular topics is the concept of health. There's a very strong health movement underway in our society. And here's my question for this morning. Will we as an Adventist denomination, and will we as members of the Adventist church, will we pick up the mantle again and lead again? Or have we fallen behind so far that we cannot get back on track? But there are people like Rick Warren that make the discovery that we want to help the people. We want to reach 8 billion people in the world with this message of health. So to help us appreciate the richness of our health message and our health heritage, and to value again and anew the incomprehensible trust given to us by a loving God, a magnificent creator, I want to take you back to the 1830s. 1830s, America. America then is some colonies on the East Coast. And this was a time when there was a call for westward expansion. I mean, people wanted to move towards the west, and the west then was Michigan. See, they moved from the eastern 13 colonies to the west. It wasn't California, not even discovered yet, but they moved to Michigan. That was the big western frontier. And there was a man by the name of John Preston Kellogg. John Preston Kellogg, in Massachusetts, he took all of his earthly belongings, which wasn't very much, put it on a cart drawn by 2 horses, and he put his children and his wife on the cart, and they were on their way to the western frontier, and they settled in Flint, Michigan. When they arrived there, they bought some land, and they began some homesteading. Tragically, the Kellogg's were sick most of the time. And the medical offerings in those days were really pathetic and pitiful. I mean, they were just plainly downright dangerous what was offered as medical care. When Mrs. Kellogg's tuberculosis progressively got worse, the physician did everything that he knew he could do. And he began to vomit Mrs. Kellogg. He began to blade her and blister her, and all of this was considered to be good medicine, and prescribing lots of laxatives. And that was considered to be good medicine in those days. And when her tuberculosis actually then got the best of her, she left behind a widower with 5 children and a new farm to take care of. Now, here's my question to you. If you were John Preston Kellogg, widower, 5 kids, 400-acre farm, what would you do? What would be the next step? Tell me, what would you do? Yeah, you would look for a nanny, right? You look for someone that would take care of the kids. And so he was looking around in Flint, Michigan, and he found this lovely lady, Ann Stanley. And, he thought about it very carefully, and then he offered her a job to come into his family and to take care of the kids. And she said, I'm very sorry, Mr. Kellogg, but, I'm already taking care of the children in the school there. I couldn't possibly take on another responsibility. I'm sorry. Now, men can be very easily hurt when they are turned down, especially by a woman, right? And he was no exception to that, and it took him some time to get his courage up again. And so he waited for a while. His courage got stronger. Then he had an idea. And he approached Ann Stanley once more. And he said, Madam, I have observed you. I know your excellent reputation in town here. Would you marry me? And she said, yes, I would. And so now he had a wife and he had someone to take care of his 5 kids. And they were a happy family. And Mrs. Kellogg was the new Mrs. Kellogg was a very intelligent, business-oriented woman. And she said, maybe we should really move. And they moved to Battle Creek. And there they had 2 more children. And then it was that little Emma had come down with an unusual disease, and she took little Emma, 2 years of age, to the physician there in charge, and he diagnosed little Emma of having worms. He gave her some very strong medication, and the drug then caused epilepsy, and 2 days later, little Emma was dead. Needless to say, the Kellogg's were very disappointed. The Kellogg's were very bitter about American medicine and what American medicine had done for them, if anything. Well, let me just take you to an idea of what it was like to be practicing medicine in those days. Here you see the new Mrs. Ann Stanley and little Emma there while she was still alive. Well, in the 1850s, medicine was represented by 2 major schools of thought, and they were represented by 2 towering icons. There was Dr. Tully and there was Dr. Gallup. These were the big icons. These were the leaders in medicine in those days. Dr. Tully believed in powerful drugs. He believed in opium and heroin and strychnine, powerful drugs, because his idea was if you give these powerful drugs to people, it challenges the system, and it becomes stronger to fight the disease that people have. And of course, in those days, many people became victims of these diseases. They were not cured by these powerful, addictive drugs. If anything, these drugs often contributed to premature death. Now, this was Dr. Tully. But then there was Dr. Gallup, and he didn't believe in these drugs. I mean, he thought that what you need to do is when you have an infection, when you have fever, the answer is very simple, because we know if you have too much blood, the temperature in the body rises. So all you need to do is withdraw blood. And he used leeches. He would take blood out of a person's veins, and as he did, and he reduced more and more blood in the patient's system, the blood temperature the temperature would go down and down and down, and the temperature would never, ever go up again because the people died. This was medicine in those days, in the 1850s. So you can see that frequently, death was one of the complications of the treatment in the practice of medicine in those days. Well, what was medicine like? You know, aside from these kind of concepts there, well, medical education was in its infancy. You would take a course for 6 months, you would get a sheepskin, and now you were called a doctor. 6 months of what we considered some educational concepts. Now, if you didn't have access to these so-called doctors, then you would have to resort to these home health guides. These were large compendiums of articles that would actually describe different symptoms and identify these symptoms as belonging to a particular disease. So patients, people themselves, the readers could identify themselves in terms of what was wrong with them. So they could identify and diagnose themselves, and they were playing doctor. And then what these home health guides also provided were medications that were in this kit. And so first you diagnose yourself, and then you match it up with the pills that you have there, and then you would treat yourself. Well, you know, this was playing doctor, something that we should be very conservative about. And especially when we talk about the chronic diseases, we need to be very careful that we do not play doctor and reduce ourselves to the point where we play doctor and actually stop our medications. Some of these medications cannot be stopped immediately. They have to be withdrawn very gradually, and you should never do this on your own. You should work with a physician. You should work with the professionals, and if they don't want to do it, you just very kindly say, well, doctor, it really is my body, and I would really like us to maybe begin to withdraw these drugs a little bit. Can we work together as a team? Be always very respectful of your physician, because someday you may actually need him for an emergency. Always be very, very gentle and kind, but insist that you would like to be gradually trying out a possible reduction in the medication. Now, I know it's a very dangerous game for you, because you're really attacking the ego of the physician that is next to God, and you're challenging him, and you're telling him what to do. Don't tell him what to do. Just say, doctor, I would really like us to work in some way. I would like to see if my body functions well. I've made some new changes in my lifestyle. Can we possibly come with up with a compromise? Can we reduce the medication to half, or, negotiate? So these were the days when people now began to playing doctor on their own. Now, these drugs that were used in these kits, they were pushed by an unscientific and unscrupulous drug industry. I mean, maybe things haven't changed too much, right? Right? You see, any drug, no matter how worthless or how outrageously adulterated, could be placed on the market. Any advertisement, no matter how fantastic they made it, any ingredient, no matter how habit-forming and how lethal, they didn't have to list it on the ingredient list. Actually, most drug advertisements in those days contained testimonials from people who had since died of the disease the drug was supposed to have cured. And these drugs tasted absolutely terrible. I mean, they stung the throat, they gagged the patient, who was often cured after only one dose, simply out of fear of having to take a second dose. Now, if you didn't have money to buy these home health guides, then you would have to rely on folk medicine. What was folk medicine like in those days? Well, let me give you some ideas. If you had an earache, they recommended take the smoke of a cigar and blow it into the ear, and that will cure the earache. If you have some lung problems, inhale the smoke of the cigar, and it will take care of the problems in your lungs. These were the folk medicine cures that were recommended in these days. Rheumatoid arthritis, oh, you will love this one, but you need to have a cat to cure this problem, because they recommended put the cat that you have at the end, at the foot of your bed, and then you go to bed and you make sure that during the night your feet touch the cat. And what happens is the arthritis will leave you, your body, it will go into the body of the cat. Good for you, worse for the cat. But that's what people believed. Fresh air, if you were a doctor and you had your small little clinic there, you made your evening rounds and you made sure that every one of the patients' windows in the rooms were closed, because it was believed that night air was dangerous to the health of the patients. Now, this was the 1830s, and then germs had not been discovered yet. And bathing, oh my goodness, if you wanted to bathe, that was considered to be dangerous to your health. You had to get a prescription from your doctor if you wanted to bathe more than once a week. I mean, this was the way it was. And then it was considered to be dangerous. It was considered to be poisonous to eat uncooked food. I mean, the story is told of a colonel in New England who was in a public marketplace. And the people saw him distressed beyond belief as he was eating a raw tomato, and people knew that this colonel was committing suicide in front of all of them, because it was believed that uncooked tomatoes were dangerous and poisonous to the body. Interesting, isn't it? Well, what about the fashions of the 1850s? Are you interested to learn something about that? Well, let me tell you what happened in those days. The biggest fad in those days was the wasp waist. You know a wasp? You know a bee? They have a very narrow middle portion, like here. And if you were a high society woman and you wanted to be seen as being up to date, you were in the in group, you made sure that you had the waist of a wasp, very tiny. And the ideal waist then was the size of the waist that would allow your husband to put his hands around the waist and the fingers would touch. That was the ideal waist. And you know, they talk about, in medical journals, of dissected livers, because oftentimes, you know, they couldn't quite get this very fashionable waist into place, so they had to invent the corset. And the corset, you know, you would have the husband pulling one of the strings, and the other string was placed on some post, and they then pulled and pulled and pulled to get this perfect waist. No wonder that many of these women died with dissected livers. That was the fashion in those days. And furthermore, I mean, listen, if I would have been a high society woman, I would have not worried about my husband's education. I would have not worried about his looks. I would have only looked at his hands. Does he have big hands? See, that was the fashion in those days. And then when you had this wasp waist, then you had these long gowns that would drape the floor, 80 pounds oftentimes in weight. That was a time when men chewed tobacco and spit it on the floor. This was a time when you had, of course, no cars, and the transportation means in those days were horses. And these horses would leave their business cards all over the floor. And then these women would come and with their long gowns, dragging the floor, and they would spread the germs that were on the floor everywhere. So no wonder that every fifth baby was dying before reaching the age of 1 of infectious diseases. Interesting fashions, interesting health concepts, interesting medical interventions. And so, this is a time when a spiritual awakening took place in the American culture. Charles Darwin had just published his book on evolution. No, it's an interesting thing, right? This is the 1840s, 1850s. This is the emergence of new denominations, a new awakening that Jesus is coming again. The second coming is at hand. People would travel all over the world and spread the word that Jesus is coming. There was a Jewish man by the name of Wolf. He went to China, not an Adventist, but he preached the message that Jesus was coming back. And that's also then the time when Garvin shows up to balance things off, right? Whenever there's a good move, there's always a counter move. And this is now the emergence of the evolutionary concepts. Well, but while this was the birth of many new denominations, there was one denomination in particular in those days that had an interesting viewpoint. You see, they believed that it was okay to take care of the human body. That was outlandish, because the Christian concept at that time was that the body is divided into the body and the soul. And the only thing that matters was that the soul goes to heaven, goes to the happy grounds. So don't maintain good, healthy bodies, because it imprisons the soul forever, too long. Let the soul emerge and go up. Don't take care of the body. It imprisons the valuable soul that wants to reach God. And this denomination had a different idea. They said, no, the body and the soul are one. And to take care of the human body is correct. It's right. It's entrusted to us by a loving Creator God. What happens next? As there was considerable resistance by Christian believers in those days about this holistic, total concept of health, this new denomination, organized in 1863, taking the name Seventh-day Adventist, said, we want to show that God will honor us as we are taking care of the human body. And they said, we will create a health institute to prove that God will help us and will provide healing for our bodies. They had this comprehensive, holistic concept. They didn't believe into this dualism, that the body is divided into two parts. And so the Seventh-day Adventist Church, organized in 1863, was convinced that it might be best to have its own medical institutions. They wanted to demonstrate the benefits of healthful living. And these Adventists were persuaded by a very humble housewife who had a grade 3 education by the name of Ellen G. White. This lady went on to write more than 100,000 pages on serious topics and became the most widely published female author in the history of the world. Her books have received wider distribution, published in more languages than any other woman in the world. Now, she said that I don't know the whereabouts, I don't know the whys, I tell you these kind of things, but I just share with you what I have been shown. I will show you what I was shown in vision. She had more than 2,000 visions. The Adventist people believe that she was one of God's special inspired writers. Now, just to give you some idea, what she talked about that was absolutely revolutionary in her day. She talked about the issue of salt and contemporary health promotion-oriented doctors and leaders. Some of them talked about no salt at all, and others talked about we need to have more salt for the human body. And she took the middle position and she said we should have some salt. And it was only about 10, 12 years ago that the American public was informed by official bodies in this country that we need to cut back on our salt because most of us are taking 10 times more salt than the body needs as a minimum. And they said, the least you can do is cut your salt in half because salt and high blood pressure are directly related. Salt and congestive heart failure are directly related. Salt and strokes are directly related. Folks, how did she know this? 100-some years ago, she talked about we should eat more coarse food. Coarse, C-O-A-R-S-E, right? Coarse food. What does coarse food mean? Coarse food means foods as it comes in nature, with all the fiber that is there. Well, the American diet has virtually no fiber at all, a measly 10 to 12 grams. She talked about we need to have more coarse food, and she talked about cut back on meats. We didn't even know anything about cholesterol in those days. How did she know these things? She recommended to eat more fruits and more vegetables, and she talked to eat more whole, unrefined grain foods. She talked about to eat more legumes like beans and lentils. And she talked about eat some nuts and some seeds. But she also said be careful in terms of what you do with your fats. Cut back on your fats. Here are some of the counsel that she offered. Modest use of salt intake, more coarse food, more whole foods like fruits and vegetables and whole grains and beans and lentils, simply prepared without all the grease and oil and fat. She said that over 100 years ago. This is contemporary current science. There's Dr. Esselstyn. He said, you want to reverse heart disease? Not one drop of oil. Well, that might be a little radical, but you know, when people have serious heart disease, maybe that might be a therapeutic dose. She talked about it in those days. Don't put all the grease and oil and fat into it. And she talked about cut back on meat and dairy, if you want to use it at all, she said. Avoid tobacco. She talked about electricity was in the human body, and we hadn't even discovered yet that every cell has a small microcurrent. And then she talked about poisonous drugs. She said pregnant women should not use drugs in particular because they could lead to malformed children. And it was not until the 1970s, thereabouts, that the big scandal broke in Germany, where they found that women who had been given by their physicians during pregnancy a drug called thalidomide, these women gave birth to flipper children. These babies were born without arms and without legs. Flipper children. How did she know these things 100 years ago? And she said, avoid alcohol. She called tobacco a malignant poison. Now remember, what a terminology. This woman had a great education. She talked about a malignant poison. And we didn't know anything about that smoking was causing lung cancer until 100 years later in 1960. How did she know this 100 years earlier? She said about tobacco, she said in 1864, tobacco is a poison of the most deceitful and malignant kind. Amazing. I mean, the vocabulary alone and the whole concept. And yet, it took the American Surgeon General 102 years ago to catch up with the wisdom of Ellen G. White and saying there's a relationship between smoking and lung cancer. Took 102 years. In the meantime, in May 1866, the small church became very committed to establishing their own medical treatment program, and they were beginning to raise funds. And they had a small man by the name of Loughborough that would go and visit the Adventists to raise money for this new center that they were developing. And Loughborough was not very successful. I mean, he was not successful at all, and things were looking very, very bad. And then he came to the broom factory of John Preston Kellogg. Remember the man who left Massachusetts? The man who lost his wife to tuberculosis, who lost his little baby later on because of maltreatment and so on. Remember? Yeah, that was John Preston Kellogg. He was now very successful in producing brooms. And Kellogg, no, not Kellogg, Loughborough, this short man, came to the broom factory and said, Mr. Kellogg, we're raising funds for building a new health center. Would you be interested in helping us? And remember, Kellogg was very bitter about traditional so-called medicine in those days. And he said, yes, sir. And he gave him a check equivalent to $50,000. And Loughborough grew several inches. He was so happy. I mean, and he stepped across the street to the home of the Whites, Ellen White and Ellen James White. And he said, $50,000 equivalent as a check from John Preston Kellogg. What are you going to do to help me? And the White said, we will match it. We know that there will be some royalties coming in for our books in the future. We will make a commitment to matching $50,000. And this was the birth of the Battle Creek Western Health Reform Institute, and it was successful from the very beginning. They believed in hydrotherapy, they believed in simple treatments, they believed in a very simple diet, and they believed in helping people to get educated, what we knew in those days. Now, they became rather quickly successful, and they realized that they needed to have some good physicians to man and to lead in this institute. And there was a young man by the name of John Harvey Kellogg. He was actually mentored by the Whites. And he was a very promising medical student. He did very well. They sent him to a special training program to the best medical institution in the world at that time in America. And he went to Bellevue Hospital. He was trained there. And when he came back, he was named the youngest medical administrator in America. And he took over the Western Health Reform Institute, and he renamed it immediately with a new name called Sanitarium. Sanitarium means the place where you teach people how to live healthily. And he turned the Battle Creek Sanitarium into the medical mecca of the world. Now remember, in those days, in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, in those days, if you were admitted to a hospital, that was considered to be the waiting room of death. If you would go to the hospital, you had a 50-50 chance of coming out alive. Now, you heard what medicine was like in those days. But in Battle Creek, things were different. Over the next 10 years, Kellogg served more than 20,000 patients. That means 10,000 patients should have not come out alive, right? Instead, he only lost 100 instead of 10,000. And this made Battle Creek famous all over the world. And people came from all over the world. Royalties, everybody that had any good reputation, that had a major societal role to play, would come to Battle Creek for their health improvements. Now, Battle Creek then, because of this very low mortality at the sanitarium, became world class and became the medical mecca of its day. I mean, this was the in place. I mean, you see here they're doing outdoor exercises. This was just the development. They had just developed the gramophone, and they were already, this is Jane Fonda of her day. This is 1900. where they're doing exercise outdoors to get sunshine and fresh air and move those limbs. Who came to Battle Creek? Well, let me just give you a little idea of who was coming to Battle Creek in those days. Here you see Henry Ford would regularly come to Battle Creek. You see Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison would sit spellbound at the feet of John Harvey Kellogg when he would show up at night in his white suit, and he would deliver the parlor lecture. That was the highlight of the day for these people there at the sanitarium. He was a great speaker. He was mesmerizing. You would have Ivan Pavlov, the man that did the experiments with the dogs, and he would be there and have his research department there at the Battle Creek Sanitarium. Then you have the Mayo brothers that later on started the Mayo Clinic. They would sit at the feet of Dr. Kellogg and learn the techniques of surgery. This was an incredible time to be alive. And then you had John Rockefeller. John Rockefeller came to Battle Creek and told Dr. Kellogg, I'm sorry, but my doctors have given me 6 months to live because of bleeding ulcers. Is there anything that you can do? And Kellogg was a researcher. Kellogg was always involved in something to satisfy his curiosity of how the body works. He had written large books on the new dietetics and so on. And when Rockefeller came to him and said, sir, what can you do for me? Kellogg just pulled out a sheet of 20 guidelines, and he said, Mr. Rockefeller, follow these 20 principles, and you will live a long life. But let me just add one more principle for you, sir. Be generous, and don't forget the sanitarium. Rockefeller lived to be 98 years, the richest man in his day. Well, Kellogg was considered to be one of the highest ranking surgeons in America. He was a remarkable teacher. He was a best-selling author. He was a leading health advocate, and he was a researcher and an inventor. To Kellogg, nothing seemed to be more important in the recovery of health than teaching people how to live. It wasn't the fashion that we have today. Diagnose the ill, match it with a pill, send them home with a bill, next one, 15 minutes later. No. He said, I want to teach you how you need to live because you will empower your body to heal itself. It's built into the system. The Creator made it in such a way. The body will begin to heal itself, but you have to put the right things into the system. You have to get enough sleep. You have to get your exercise. You have to become a kinder, nicer person. That's what we've been talking every morning here, right? Well, there you see, Kellogg in his white suit talked about education, motivation, and inspiration. He talked about biologic living. He talked about the rules for right living. That's what he called it. Well, people have asked the question, why was it that Battle Creek and the treatments there were always 5 to 10 years ahead of the general medical practices in America? And some thoughtful authors have suggested that Kellogg was probably 5 to 10 years ahead of anybody else in the treatment of these diseases because as long as he listened to the prophet, as long as he asked her for special insight, Battle Creek was safe. You see, the physicians in those days, when new treatments came up, they had to first do it by trial and error. Try it out. Is it working? Is it not? Kellogg didn't have to do this because Kellogg knew he had the certainty of the prophetess. That saved him probably 5 to 10 years. Of course, it had a powerful effect on the Adventist church because the fame of Battle Creek was now actually also being felt among the Adventist church. People began to inquire about the Adventist church because you see, health is the right arm to the hearts of the people. That was the whole concept. My question is it possible that the right arm, the health message, has become stale? It has dried up? Maybe we have even severed it? Could it be that perhaps we should reattach the right arm to the body and let it do its work in reaching people, serving people, creating gratitude and trust in people who then come and say, are there some other things, deeper things that you can share with us? Why do you do what you do? Why are you a friendly person? Why are you such a generous person? Could it be the time is now to reattach the right arm? Is it now that perhaps we need to attach it to in our own lives first before we can go out and help other people? Because we are called to be role models. I used to have a secretary that was overweight. And people said to me, how can you have a secretary that's overweight? Well, she was actually obese. And I would tell the people, she's a very wonderful person, and she is on my program, and you will see her gradually lose more and more and more weight. Folks, you can run chip programs if you want to, even if you're not the healthy person, but you can tell people, I'm working on it with you. You don't have to look the part when you start. Just let people know, I'm working with you, help me. We're doing it together. And so what was the Adventist church then actually advocating? They talked about a new lifestyle of holistic living. They talked about a simple diet, plant strong whole foods, daily exercise, weekly day of rest, plenty of water, no alcohol, tobacco, or caffeine, and a balanced life, mental hygiene, and a trust in God. The New Start concepts. You know those things. And with that came, as we have now found through scientific research, that Adventist people anywhere in the world live from 7 to 14 to up to 20 years longer, depending on what they were willing to do to exercise and to implement what the counsel had been given to us. As a matter of fact, Loma Linda and the Adventist Church in general is now considered to be one of the 5 blue zones in the world where people live longer lives than anywhere else. You come to Loma Linda and you find people that are 106, 105, 100 years of age. You go to the dormitory there and you find a women's choir. And if you want to join the choir there of this particular group of women, you have to be at least 90 years of age. I mean, this is Loma Linda. This is longevity stars. This is what the Adventist Church wants you to be and to show it to people. Well, let me just come very quickly to the conclusion. You see, what you have today is a verification of Ellen G. White's concepts. Here you see some of the leaders today that are pushing these kind of ideas. You have Nathan Pritikin, that was famous. You have Castelli from the Framingham Study. You have T. Colin Campbell, who wrote the book, The China Study. You have Dr. Neil Barnard that talked about reversing diabetes within weeks. You have Dr. Dean Ornish, who showed that you can reverse coronary artery disease and open up these arteries again by following a very simple diet of a very low-fat diet of foods as grown. And here you have Dr. Esselstyn. We talked about him the other day. Plant-based, very low-fat, whole food diet. And we showed you the results yesterday. Coronary arteries are narrowed because of atherosclerotic plaque. And here, after 2.5 years, they're wide open again. No medication, no surgery. Just a difference in diet. And then you have the film Forks Over Knife that's produced by Hollywood, the most successful documentary in the history of Hollywood. Forks over knives. What that means is the forks are more powerful than the knives of the surgeons in taking care of heart disease. And it's everywhere. And then you have the president, President Clinton has adopted to this very lifestyle. And then people come to me and say, I mean, can you really live longer? Yeah. Here's Harvard, a large study on 125,000 people that they followed for over 25 years, and they found out there were 5 things that would help these people to live longer. They found that women at the age of 50 could expect to live either 79 years or 93 years. a difference of 14 years. They found that men at the age of 50, they could live either to become, to live to 76 or to 88 years, 12 years longer, 12 and 14 years longer. What made the difference? Why did some of these people live to be 93 and 88 while others died at 79 and 76? What was the difference? They found 5 characteristics that made the difference. To live 14 or 12 years longer. What do you think that was? Better medicine? Better doctors? Better hospitals? No. What was it? They never smoked. They had a normal weight. Folks, it's time to lose weight. You know, Kentucky, one of the big states here with one of the highest rates of obesity. As a matter of fact, when you go from Mississippi all the way up to Michigan, these states that we have there are considered to be the coronary corridor. That's where you have the highest rates of heart disease in America. Folks, it's time. Don't you think it's time to do something? Don't you think God is calling us and said, I have the answers for you. You have the answer for the world. But it was not just normal weight, exercise, 30 minutes a day, limited alcohol, if any at all, and a good diet. And when they talk about a good diet, they talk about the people had a very simple diet, foods as grown, without all the sugar and the salt and the fat, without all the cholesterol and so on, without all the cheese and so on. These people would live 12 to 14 years longer. And so today, we come to the point where we recognize that what we're experiencing today, where we have a brand new medical specialty called lifestyle medicine. There are over 3,000 physicians now that have become trained in lifestyle medicine, where they now understand nutrition and communication and psychology and how to motivate people to do what we need to do. The fastest growing medical specialty in America is lifestyle medicine specialists. And we think, wow. And we go back to the Adventist experience and we say, wait a minute, isn't this just a rerun of Battle Creek? Where people were inspired by an American Battle Creek housewife who had a divine inspired vision. And you had a very intelligent physician that knew how to practice medicine in an enlightened fashion. Isn't this ringing back? We were the leaders. We were the medical mecca in the world. And we are called to become in the forefront again. I want that special lady, Heather, to come and help us to close our program as we make our commitment to a God that has been so generous in endowing us, in giving us the special gifts of listen to the prophet and you will succeed.
Let's stand as we sing together. Jesus has promised he's coming soon, and never again must we part, but to be ready to hear his call, I must live with all of my heart. Let me hear you sing. I'll live with all of my heart today. I'll give him my truest, my best. I'll live with all of my heart today, and in health and happiness rest.
Thank you so much, Heather. And thank you so much to our pianist. Please sit down. I want to take a couple of minutes to recommend something to you as we close our meeting here. When you go to the bookstore sometime today, you find two books there that are on my stand. One is called God's Nutritionist, Pearls of Wisdom from Ellen G. White. This was an editing by a prominent Jewish scientist who found the book Counsels to Food, Diet, and Foods. And he was so enthralled, and he said, when was this book written? Because this is contemporary current science at its very, very best. And then he said, I want to distill some of the most important 500 guidelines that she has given for living a healthy, full life. And he came up with this book here, God's Nutritionist, and you can see there are 500 guidelines. He said, it seems that Adventists no longer read those books. They're just too large. I will make it easy for them. I will distill it into 500 principles. And then he said, in addition to this, I will take the book that she wrote, Ministry of Healing, and again, I will distill it into the important things, and I will make it available through a non-Adventist publisher. He did. He was so enthralled, he called me up the other day and he said, Hans, I adore Ellen G. White. He said, she is one of the largest, most important philosophical minds of this time. What she wrote 100 years ago today is current scientific backed up knowledge. And he said, I would love the Adventist church to become the leaders in America to bring health back to the people in terms of intelligent self-care. He said, can you help me? I said, I'm going to be in Kentucky. I'm going to be in Tennessee. I'm going to try it out and see if the people are open to these ideas. And I know you are, aren't you? Take a look at these two wonderful books, Food for Thought, Words to Live by Ellen G. White, and then God's Nutritionist, Pearls of Wisdom from Ellen G. White, edited, extracted by a foremost Jewish scientist who believes stronger in the special gift of prophecy, perhaps, and the visions that she had than maybe some Adventists today. Let's team up with my friend Robert Cohen, who discovered the joy of living a healthier life himself and promoting it through these edited books that are available in the bookstore today. Thank you very much.